Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And today's episode takes us back to the 18th century and the early life of the second Duke of Northumberland.
Before he was the Duke living here at the castle, Hugh Percy was a soldier and spent several years in America at the very beginning of the Revolutionary War that resulted in American independence from British rule. During his years in America, in the British Army, Percy wrote many letters and papers which have never been fully studied and researched until now.
The Road to Lexington is a new book by Bill Openshaw exploring Percy's letters from America. Bill is one of our regular guests here on the Alnwick Castle podcast, so we brought him back again to find out more.
Here's our conversation with Bill. Please enjoy. We're very happy to be joined on the Alnwick Castle podcast by Bill Openshaw, author of the new book, The Road to Lexington, Letters and Papers of Lord Percy, 1768 to 1776. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Daniel. Nice to be back.
How are you today?
I'm good. Enjoying the sunshine.
Yes. Are you ready to talk about Lord Percy in America?
Yeah, why not?
Well, I think I probably want to start with asking what made you want to look back into this period of his life. We've heard from you before about his time in Alnwick with the Percy Tenantry Volunteers, but this is 20, almost 30 years later.
Yeah.
Earlier.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, it's not something I consciously thought about doing. It was while I was researching for my first book about the Percy Tenantry. I came across a book that was printed about 1901, I believe, turn of the last century. It was about 33 letters written by Lord Percy during the American Revolution. Shortly afterwards, I discovered in the archives that there are lots of letters and all sorts of documents in several volumes, vast majority never been published before, and it all contains his history during the American Revolution and his point of view. And I thought, that would be interesting to subject for another book. And so we have part one already published now.
And how did you start going through all of that many papers and books?
From the beginning.
Were they in order? Were they catalogued?
Thankfully, yes. Yeah. The vast majority, I would say 99.5%, are in order. There's one or two you find that are not, but sometimes there's a good reason for that. But you'll have to ask the archivist about that one. Yeah. So what I did, I wanted to be a history of the kind of the Fifth Foot as well, because he became Colonel of the Fifth Foot, and the reason why he was in America was because of the Fifth Foot. Everybody knows them as Northumberland Fusiliers at the time. So I thought that was a good point to start, and it's a sort of build-up to him going to America, and then whatever follows after that. So that was my starting point. Prior to all the letters from America, there are other documents in the castle that cover that period before the war. So I had a look at that, and I selected various documents within that, tried to build up a story of who Percy was, what kind of commander he was, for instance. And then after that, as I say, we've got this volume of letters and documents that, follow his journey, if you like, through the early years of the war. To be honest, it wasn't a subject I knew a great deal about. I'm more of a Napoleonic sort of guy. So I was looking at it from fresh eyes, from a fresh perspective. And so I had to do a little bit of study and try and create a narrative of what was happening and put everything into context. So that's what I've tried to do in the new book, yeah.
So we should probably start at the beginning and try and go in order as well.
Yeah.
How does Percy's military career start?
Well, of course, he was the eldest son of the first Duke, and it wasn't normal at all for the firstborn son to enter a military career. Usually he would be the heir, would be the second son, perhaps would join military service, maybe the third son would go into the church or something like that. So it was something his parents weren't very keen about. How he got the bug for the military, I don't know. One possibility may have been his uncle, which was actually Lord Granby, and he became the commander of the British Army over in Europe during the 7-Year War. So that might have had something to do with his interest in the military, but I can't prove that. But nevertheless, he joined the army at the age of 17. Back then, they used to buy a commission, so presumably his father bought him a commission in a regiment. And before he joined it, he left it, which is a bit strange. And he bought a commission for a captain in a brand new regiment that has just been raised. It was going to be an elite light infantry regiment, which is covered really in my last book about light infantry, but he was with them for a short period, and then it seemed they were going to be posted to the West Indies, which was pretty much a death sentence for a lot of soldiers back in that day with all the horrible diseases. He ended up going to Germany. He left his regiment, he went to Germany, and he became an aide to one of the generals, British generals over there. And as I say, the commander-in-chief at that time was his uncle, the Marquis of Granby. After about a year, he returned back to England. He continued to finish off his education, and possibly his parents thought, right, he's had his fill of the army now. He'll settle down and become, the heir. But clearly not. He got a bit bored and he went back into the army, and then 1768 he became Colonel of the 5th Foot, the Northumberland Fusiliers, which did upset a few people.
The change of name?
Not the change of name.
Or him being in charge?
Him becoming commander, because he was quite young. The 5th Foot was one of the best regiments. And so a lot of people thought, well, why is he becoming colonel? There should be other people getting it before him. So I think he upset a few people in the military. Something that never went away, I think. In some circles, I think he always had that little bit of opposition because he'd got this very special regiment at the time, if you like. But I think he proved himself to be a good soldier. Certainly, as we say, the 5th Foot absolutely loved him. And when, I think it was after the Revolution, the regiments were asked to take on a county name. The 5th Foot asked if they could take the name Northumberland in honour of Percy, because he was so well beloved and thought of by the regiment.
And he comes across as quite a generous, fair kind of commander through the book. I know it's from his perspective, but that is the impression you got? Oh,
definitely. I think it's well known that he was generous, not just to his soldiers, but to people in general. Certainly studying Percy from a later point of view, when he became second Duke, he was very, very generous, as was his father, and his son after him, actually. I think it was the Percy way. Very humane. The first Duke was a humane man, and the second Duke was very, very similar. And yes, he looked after his regiment, and as I say, that's one of the reasons they wanted to take the name Northumberland. He looked after the men, he looked after their wives, and it comes across in the book, some of the things he did for them. Yeah,
especially contrasted to some of the really harsh punishments that soldiers were getting at that time.
Well, this is what, he was actually against corporal punishment. He was against lots of things, but corporal punishment, that's not to say he wouldn't inflict it if necessary, but he'd rather avoid it. He was a more of carrot than stick sort of leader. He was known for that.
It's the kind of leader you want, probably.
I think so. He was the kind of guy that would lead from the front. I mean, the Duchess quite famously wrote a letter saying, there's not many men in your position that would actually walk with the men. Most of the officers would be on horseback, especially on a long route march, but he actually marched with them. He wanted to endure whatever his men were enduring, which was quite different for the time,
And do we know that they liked him because of the letters and documents that you found? Is that something that you found whilst you were researching? To an extent,
I think it's well documented in articles written about the Duke in the past, so that was nothing new. It just came more to the fore, and perhaps one or two of the little instances that just proved yet again that he was a man. He was a man's man, if you like, and he looked after his people. He really did care. And during new letters that have just been discovered, which we might get to later, again, that comes out how he actually cared for various people,
So by this point, he's with the 5th Foot.
Yes.
He's served in Europe, but the 1770s come around and he's got to go a lot further away over to Boston. How does it come about that they're having to go to America?
Well, we've probably heard, all aware of the story of the Boston Tea Party and all of this. Those colonials over there start to play up a little bit. And the government thinks, well, the best way is to just quell all of this nonsense, and we send the military over, and a large military force will just quieten everything down. Obviously, it didn't prove to be the case, but Lord Percy was one of the first regiments to be sent over to America. There were some regiments already there, but they needed reinforcing. Percy's regiment was chosen to go there, and strangely enough, his parents weren't very happy about that. Quite famously, the family had a lot of sympathy for the American colonials at the time. The way the government had been treating them, they weren't too happy about, and they tried to get an exemption from Lord Percy going over there in the first place. But Percy decided, no, I'm a soldier. It's my duty to go with my regiment. Whatever distasteful duties I've been given, I'm going with my regiment. And that's what he did. As I say, he had a get-out clause, but he didn't take it. He went with his men to America.
And how did he feel about the Americans? Was he with his parents in that sense? And did that change once he was over there?
Before he went, I think he did, but I don't think it took very long at all for him to change his mind. One of his first letters from Boston, he's calling them slyful, hypocritical scoundrels, basically. He didn't have a good view of them. No.
But America as a place, he seems to have been quite impressed by the landscapes. There was a quote that stood out in the book to me, comparing it to the Capability Brown landscapes at Alnwick and other places. And he was looking at America and wrote, Mr. Brown would be useless here. Yeah. So he must have enjoyed the American countryside, at least.
I think so. How far he was allowed to venture outside of Boston is a little uncertain. It wouldn't have been very good for a man in uniform, for instance, to be seen out of Boston at the time because of the unrest. So if he did go out, he possibly had gone out in civilian clothes. I believe many of the officers would go out in civilian clothes and enjoy the countryside, exercise their horses. A couple of times he went on route marches, and perhaps he saw the countryside from that as well. But yeah, he certainly enjoyed it. And in a few of his letters, he describes the types of trees, even the animals, the cows and things like that. And you're right, I think he's taken aback by the beauty of Massachusetts. And he does say something like, Capability Brown's landscape is nothing compared to this. If he went back to Boston today, he might change his mind. It's built on, but at the time it must have been very picturesque. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in terms of who he was telling this to, who was he corresponding most with at the time?
He wrote obviously a lot of letters home to his parents, his father, and his mother. Unfortunately, we don't have any of the letters sent to his mother, which is a bit of a mystery. Other people he wrote to was a man called Henry Reveley, who happened to be the first Duke's cousin, but he was closer in age to Lord Percy. And we know that this Henry Reveley had spent quite a lot of time as a young man, or a child perhaps, at Northumberland House. So he would have been well acquainted with Lord Percy. Presumably that's where they met and became good friends. And so they would correspond with each other throughout the war. Another man was a man called the Reverend Thomas Percy. No relation. He was quite a famous cleric of the period. He wrote several books on different things, and he was very much interested in the Percy heritage. I think he thinks that he was from the Percy line, as it were, and he actually became the chaplain to the first Duke and Duchess for a period before he became chaplain to the King. But he obviously had a good relationship with Lord Percy as well. And again, the correspondence between the two men lasted over the war as well.
Is he telling slightly different things to the different people he's writing to? Is he revealing more to some people than others?
Well, when it comes to the engagements, the military side of things, it differs quite a bit. Some letters are going into quite detail of what happened. Others, he's just quickly scanning over it. And there's a lot of personal things in them, family things, He talks about his brother Algernon a few times, and his brother meeting this young lady who eventually marries, mentions his sister, who he's obviously got an eye for, and ultimately ends up marrying her as well, which is quite interesting.
So that's Algernon's wife's sister.
Algernon's wife's sister.
No,
yeah. Yeah.
One letter that really jumped out at me when I was going through the book was by a man called Charles Lee, who ends up being George Washington's second in command.
Yeah.
So why is he involved in the British side at this point?
Well, he seems to be a bit of an interesting character. He was the son of a major general, a British major general himself. He was born in Cheshire, so a real Englishman. He'd fought in America during the 7-Year Wars, the French-Indian War, as it was called in America, on the British side, of course. Returned home. I think he was put on half pay, which a lot of the soldiers were. So he went off to fight for the King of Poland. He got into an argument with somebody over there, and he ended up having a duel, and he lost 2 fingers in the duel. He seemed to be a bit of a hothead, this Charles Lee. And it seems that after that, he bought some land in Virginia. And just before all the rest, or the unrest kicked off, as it were, he moved over to Virginia. And I think he started to see things a lot more from the colonial side of things rather than the British side. And then, of course, there's a letter which I found, it's before the unrest all kicks off, before Lexington, and he's trying to reason with Lord Percy. He's saying, right, you might not agree with me at this moment, but I'd like you to read this pamphlet, and if you read it, I think you might change your mind. I know your father is a very humane man, etc., with a lot of influence. Perhaps if he would read it, he would convince other people of the justness of the cause of the Americans, if you like. Whether Lord Percy ever read that leaflet, I've no idea, and what his response might have been, we don't know. But Charles Lee, as you mentioned, went on to become one of the generals, one of the first generals of the new Continental Army. Because of his experience, I think he thought he should be George Washington's second in command. George Washington, obviously, being an ex-British soldier as well, but we'll not go there. But he wasn't chosen. Another commander was chosen, but when this commander eventually stood down a year later, Charles Lee was appointed second in command. But he didn't do that well. He was captured by the British, and then after a year or so in captivity, he was exchanged for British officers. He was given a command again. He disobeyed orders from George Washington, was court-martialed for that, as well as disrespecting the general, which you don't want to do. He then got into an argument with one of George Washington's aides, ended up having another duel, and was wounded again. Incidentally, I think during the 7-Year War, he actually married a Mohawk Indian, to which he had a couple of children, and the Indian name for him was Boiling Water, to reflect his temperament. He seemed to have a bit of a short temper, but certainly a character. Yeah.
So in terms of the book, it's called The Road to Lexington. Now, for those people who might not know, can you tell us what happened at Lexington?
Well, Lexington is when it all kicked off, really. They say it was a shot that went round the world. It started the American Revolution. Technically, it's not true, but in history, it's regarded as the first thing that ignited the revolution. Over the preceding months, basically, a lot of the American colonials had started collecting arms and ammunition and storing it in various places. Obviously, General Gage and the authorities thought, this isn't a good idea, all this ammunition and armaments in the hands of the Americans. we need to go and get it. They went to a few other places first to retrieve this ammunition, etc. And then they sent a force to Lexington. Well, they were supposed to actually go into Concord, but on the night in question, they marched towards Concord. Lexington was en route. They got there about 7 o'clock in the morning. They found themselves facing a party of American militiamen. They were told to stand down by the British. They didn't move. But I believe that both commanders said, do not fire. There was a bit of a standoff, and then a shot was fired. Now, even today, modern American historians believe, we don't know who fired the first shot. Historically, the Americans always blame the British always blame the Americans for firing the shot, but now modern historians are not quite sure. It was a single shot. Some people say it was from a third party. We don't know. But whatever happened, a shot was fired. The British then fired a volley. The Americans replied. It ended up with several Americans, 3-4 dead, if I remember right, and a British soldier wounded. The British followed up with a bayonet charge and scattered the Americans. They then went on to Concord to look for the arms and ammunition. A party of the British was sent to a bridge north of Concord, where very soon they found themselves outnumbered by American militiamen coming towards them. They had to start retiring back. More and more Americans were coming, militiamen and Minutemen, and soon they were virtually surrounded. They started to retreat back towards Lexington. In the meantime, sometime in the early hours of the morning, the British officer suspected he might face a little bit of opposition. He sent word to Boston for help. So about 9 o'clock in the morning, Lord Percy left Boston and headed towards Lexington. He got there just in the nick of time. The first lot of British soldiers virtually out of ammunition. So they stayed in Lexington for about 45 minutes. Lord Percy famously deployed 2 guns to fire on the Americans and burnt a few houses to stop them occupying them and firing on the British. After 45 minutes, they decided their plan and they started the retreat back to Boston. Technically, the British should have been annihilated, really. The Americans weren't fighting in the standard form of warfare. At the time, it was fighting in lines. The American militiamen, most of them, many of them were volunteer soldiers, amateur soldiers, and they started using irregular warfare. They were hiding behind walls and hedges and buildings, taking pot shots at the British, trying not to get too close, but inflicting a lot of casualties, completely outnumbering the British, so it was very hard to defend against these sort of tactics. But Percy organised his men in such a way that he could defend quite well, and he retreated all the way to Boston very successfully. The route he'd gone to through Lexington was through a place called Cambridge. At the time, Boston was almost an island. It was only accessible through a very thin neck, and you had to cross a river at Cambridge. And that's where he'd gone. The Americans were presuming he was going to go back the same way. So they formed up a lot of troops there. They took up the bridge, so Percy wouldn't have been able to cross the river to get back into Boston. Percy was a man who knew a lot about maps. He's very keen on maps, one of the few British officers at the time probably, and he knew about a small road that went left just before they reached Cambridge, and he decided to take that road, which led to a place called Charlestown. The Americans weren't expecting this, but he went that, and as he got to a place called Bunker Hill, he found safety because the Americans couldn't attack him from the side anymore. So they held the ground there for a small while. The British Navy sent ships over from Boston over to Charlestown, and they escaped. The interesting thing, of course, is about a month or two later, the famous Battle of Bunker Hill. If the British had stayed there, instead of shipping all the men over to Boston, there would have been no Battle of Bunker Hill. But that's a different story.
And we might get onto different stories, but I wanted to ask about the other people from Alnwick and Northumberland that feature in the book, because Lord Percy's got the connections with the castle, but there are local northeast guys over there with him.
Oh, there are, yeah, which I think is really nice. In one of the letters, Percy says that Alnwick is well represented. They should be proud, really. So there's a few names from the area, apart from Lord Percy. There was a gentleman from Alnwick called Edward Gare. He'd gone over with the Fifth Foot as a surgeon's mate. So every regiment had a surgeon and usually a mate or two mates. And that's what they would have to look after, the whole regiment if they were wounded or something like that. And Edward Gare's father was a man, if I remember correctly, was a man called Arthur Gare, who had a practice in Alnwick. And he must have been quite a formidable doctor. He gave out inoculations, for instance, in a time when it wasn't really a common thing. And obviously he knew this Edward Gare, I presume a similar age, I'm not sure. But I'm guessing, I could be wrong here, but I'm guessing that when the Percys were in residence at Alnwick, they perhaps used his father as their local doctor. It would make sense, and hence why the two men would know each other. And later on, Edward Gare's younger brother also joined the army and went out there as well. The other gentleman is a man called William Charleton. We didn't know anything about him until last year, when the archivist's assistant, Andrew Jack, he said to me, I've just found some letters you might be interested in. And it turned out, in an envelope marked Lord Percy, was about half a dozen letters from this William Charleton from America. And they proved to be fascinating. Nobody knew anything about this guy, so I've tried to find out who he is. Can't find out much about him. His father worked for the Duke. He was a land agent for the Duke, and I believe he helped with the Duke's brother in elections and things like that. He was sort of an elections officer and helped him out with that. And I think he became a commissioner for the Duke for a small period as well. But other than that, we can find no connection. But it would show why perhaps the family were given these letters from Lord Percy. Anyway, William Charleton went out as a young ensign. He was wounded at Bunker Hill. And that's where, again, we find a bit more of the humanity of Percy. William Charleton writes home. The fascinating thing about the letter, he's going on and on and on about different things. And then in the last paragraph, by the way, I've been wounded. I mean, if I'd been writing a letter, I think that would be the first thing I said, don't worry, I've been wounded and blah, blah, blah. But no, he goes on about the multitude of things. And at the end, I've been wounded. Anyway, he says that Lord Percy is looking after me, basically. It was a period when getting hold of fresh provisions, fresh food, was very, very difficult. But he said, well, Lord Percy's managed to find some for us, probably very expensive to get hold of. But then William Charleton is sent home to recuperate and also to recruit. One of the letters is when he's recruiting down in London, and again he says, I've been to visit the Duke and Duchess at Northumberland House, and they entertained me very well. I haven't had time to come home, so presumably he didn't get back home to Alnwick, but he'd been to see the Duke. And I think he mentions that the Duchess is a bit worried about Lord Percy, which I guess is natural. And then he goes back to America on duty. He's promoted to a captain, takes part in a little bit more action, and the very last letter is probably the last letter he ever wrote, because he actually dies over there. I think it's a very poignant letter. He talks about what's been going on, and then near the end, he does the same thing. I've been wounded. This time, it appears to be he's been wounded in the knee. He says it's not too much, it's fairly trifling, really. But records show that 6 weeks later, he was dead. Presumably, perhaps his leg needed to be amputated, or sepsis set in, or whatever, but he actually died from it. So it's quite a poignant letter. But yes, he was one of the men from Alnwick.
It must have been exciting to come across that with Andrew last year.
Oh yeah, it was absolutely thrilling to think that, not many people have come across this record, because we didn't know it existed. The archivist didn't know it existed, so it was a fantastic find. Those letters have actually been added in the book as a memory to him more than anything else, to be honest. It gives us more information, more light on what it was like for British soldiers. But for me, it was to mark him as a man that's an unknown soldier, if you like, that did his duty and didn't come home, like many generations have done before. Yeah. The British were ultimately forced to evacuate Boston in the early part of 1776. They went to Halifax in New Brunswick, Canada, to recuperate, and then they set off on their next phase of the war. A campaign in New York, which Percy's very much involved with again. So, without spoiling too much, he's involved with a few battles there. And again, there's a lot of documents that have come to light that have never been publicised before, published. And again, more journals which have never been published. Quite interesting, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast to talk about your book.
Thank you for having me, and we'll look forward to part 2.
Yes, absolutely. The Road to Lexington is available now in hardback and paperback. Get your copy online or here at Alnwick Castle's gift shop, where you can also find Bill's previous book, To the Call of Bugles.
For more from Bill on the Alnwick Castle podcast, head back into our back catalogue to find episode 57, To the Call of Bugles, or episode 32, The Second Duke of Northumberland, and look out for more about Lord Percy in America in the near future.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast. We'll be back in July with another new episode. Until then, I've been Deborah.
And I've been Daniel.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.